Okay, welcome to the lecture on immigrant families. Every time I lecture on this topic, I have to spend a lot of time looking things up. It's so much complicated policy, and it takes a lot for me to grasp it, and I'm still not ever completely confident that I've got it all correct. So you'll hear my tentativeness, and you can feel free to correct me. And I always remind myself, if this is really hard for me, someone who has a lot of education, I can only imagine how confusing it is for people who have a lot less education, are less familiar with U.S. protocols, and for whom English is their second language. Okay, so here's just an overview of some immigration trends on these next couple of slides. So first, the immigrant population, both with documentation and without, constitutes about 14% of the total United States population. And as I understand it, the U.S. is the nation with the highest percentage of immigrants. People come here for a variety of reasons. For economic reasons is a big one, for a better life or career paths, education, all those kinds of things. People also come because they have family members here that they want to be with. And then they also come as refugees fleeing dangerous situations in their countries of origin. Immigrants can come here more in a permanent way, getting, for example, a green card, or they can be what's called more circular, and often referred to as circular labor migration, where people are coming into the country to earn some extra, get better wages that they're sending back home to their country of origin, and then they might be going back home to that country of origin. And this could be legally with work visas or without documentation. Okay, immigrants generally, both if we group them all together, have what's called a bimodal education status, more on the low end or the high end compared to the general U.S. population. So instead of a normal curve, we'd see two curves, basically. So what you can see on the graph there is that on average, less than 10% of immigrants from Mexico and Central America have bachelor's degrees, but 78% from India and pretty high rates from Asian countries have bachelor's degrees. And that's compared to overall in the U.S., 36% of people over the age of 25 have bachelor's degrees. So again, that's that disparity between really low education or very high education. Interestingly, immigrant parents from any country have very high education aspirations for their kids. That's often a reason why they're here, yet there's kind of varying success for that. On average, immigrants have lower crime rates than U.S. citizens, and undocumented immigrants account for about 5% of the workforce here in the United States. So in terms of trends in origin country and legal status, as of 2017, the majority of immigrants are here legally, 77%, and 23% without documentation. Unauthorized or undocumented immigrants are declining overall, mainly due to declines from Mexico. Basically, more Mexican immigrants left than came, and the immigration is also declining from Europe and South America, but it's increasing from Asia, Africa, and Central America. The first graph shows us that U.S.-Mexico border apprehensions are lower than in the past overall, but arrests have been going up. So they declined under the second Obama administration, that's the dip there, but then they rose sharply in 2018 under the Trump administration. So as I understand it, under federal law, people who illegally enter the U.S. or commit other immigration violations can either face civil or criminal sanctions. Civil immigration matters are basically heard in administrative courts run by the Department of Justice and can result in deportation. Criminal immigration matters are heard in federal trial courts and can result in incarceration prior to deportation. So we have seen an increase in the criminalization of immigration violations. It may come as a surprise to know that many undocumented or illegal immigrants actually pay taxes and Social Security that they never get back. And so that's money coming into the U.S. as a result of them. We do pay money as citizens and through our taxes for the education of illegal immigrants, and there is some cost for hospitals. But you can see that in running the numbers, the cost overall to the United States for people being here in undocumented forms is actually fairly small. Okay, so an amazing 1 in 4 children live in an immigrant family. The vast majority of those, 91%, are U.S. citizens themselves, the children. But about 30% of children in immigrant families live with 1 or more undocumented parents. And of those, again, still about 80% are U.S. citizens, but about 20% are without documentation themselves. In terms of immigrant parents and kids, there's, as we might imagine, a lot of challenges. Often on average having less income, less education, less English proficiency, facing more discrimination. Being a newcomer in any situation is more challenging. It takes a while to get your feet under you. And of course, that intense fear of deportation and family separation for immigrants without documentation. Yet a lot of immigrants come from countries with more of a collectivist culture, high emphasis on kind of family support and obligation and responsibilities, and so that can lead to really high quality family relationships that can then kind of buffer some of the acculturative stress. So this is a pyramid developed by Drebbe, which really illustrates how our current immigration policies have effects on children, and this is particularly for undocumented immigrants. So at the bottom of the pyramid is kind of the most basic experiences. The top of the pyramid is the more rare. So at the bottom, kids are experiencing kind of confusion about immigration status and might not be comfortable owning their immigration status, might feel discriminated against. At the very next level, we've got just fears about deportation and family separation. And then in kind of the short term and long term, we've got that kind of ongoing economic distress and that emotional distress and economic instability. And then at the top level, we've started to get some, basically deportation or family separation, which is the least common, but obviously incredibly challenging. Okay, Gonzalez did some really nice research talking about the transition into emerging adulthood for undocumented children and kind of the painful experience that they might have, basically moving from almost kind of a de facto legal status to a de facto illegal status. So basically undocumented children are kind of more insulated from immigration policies compared to undocumented adults. So undocumented children do have the legal right to K through 12 education. That was based on a Supreme Court ruling that passed in the early 1980s. And FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, prevents schools from asking about or releasing documentation status. So kids in the K through 12 school system are kind of protected and might feel kind of fairly assimilated with a lot of their peers who are citizens. Yet once they begin moving into adulthood, suddenly they might experience more barriers that legally they can't work, get jobs, they can't vote. In most states, they can't obtain a driver's license, but 15 states and DC do allow it. In Colorado, we allow undocumented immigrants to obtain a driver's license as long as they provide some additional information like filing state taxes. College students, there are no federal or state laws prohibiting admission to college, but some institutions do require people to provide evidence of citizenship or legal status. Again, at the college level, immigration status is protected by FERPA, so technically we shouldn't be asking or disclosing, although I think there's some exceptions to that. And again, college students aren't eligible, undocumented college students aren't eligible for federal aid, federal financial aid. Okay, so these two policies, the DREAM Act and DACA, refer to, so this isn't something you need to know the real details on, and it's definitely not something I'm an expert on, but I put this slide up here. I created it to give us a sense of how hard it is to become a U.S. citizen. So for example, we have lots of graduate students in the HDFS department who would like to be citizens, and even with all their education and resources and support, it's a very challenging, many-year, easily a decade-year process to gain citizenship. Okay, so first, if you want to become a citizen, you have to have been here initially legally with documentation. That means with an immigrant visa. And so that means you've got temporary documentation to live in the U.S. This is often a family-related visa because you've got family members here. So if you've got a spouse, you might be able to get a visa for 2 years. If you have a fiance, you might be able to be here for 90 days. I think it can vary. You could get a student visa for the length of your schooling. You could get a work visa that could either be short terms if you're an agricultural worker and it might be less than a year, or it could be up for 3 years if you're working with, if you've got a contract with an employer in the U.S. There are other ways to come into the U.S. legally as a refugee, seeking asylum, or a humanitarian visa. I don't actually know the difference in some of those or other special programs. And so then once you've been here on a visa for some period of time, and I don't know how long that is, you can apply for a green card, which means you can be a permanent resident, but you have to have somebody sponsor you typically, unless it's through some sort of special program. And so that's usually a family member or an employer. I don't know what all the requirements of sponsorship are, but I know that there's a commitment there and perhaps even some sort of a financial agreement of financial support. And then once you've had a green card for at least 5 years, you could begin to go through the citizenship process. And you have to have been in the U.S. continuously for those 5 years. You can't be going back and forth between your original country and the United States. You have to be able to show that you've got good moral character there, that you know the U.S. Constitution, that you can read, write, and speak English, that you can pass a U.S. naturalization test of history and government, and take the oath of allegiance. Your citizenship can be expedited if you have served in the U.S. military, but you have to have had a visa or a green card for the length of enlistment while you were in the U.S. military. All of this is fairly sobering, but to perhaps wrap up on a more positive note, we are seeing in the United States basically more favorable opinions to immigrants than we have in recent years. And so you can see overall more people are thinking that immigrants from other countries are strengthening American society, but there is a pretty sharp divide between Democrats and Republicans on that, as you can see, and then also between those who are younger, particularly if you're Republican, or mainly if you're Republican, and also those with higher education are more likely to be favorable.